Dawn bruised the sky above the Neorion docks, brushing the golden horn with pale light as the long shadows of late March reached across sleeping crates. Dock workers' voices carried across planks slick with last night's drizzle. They slung burlap sacks marked with blacked-out names, Calicut, Ceylon, Alexandria, down from the belly of a Genoese carrack. The air was thick with the smell of salt and pepper, backed by a whiff of saffron and sweat. A stevedore, Nikitas, spat into his palm and swung another sack to the growing mound. Black pepper from the Malabari coast, the last such bounty the city would see for months. On the quay's edge stood a knot of merchants, Venetian and Genoese mostly, all anxious eyes and whispered calculations. They watched the unloading as though waiting for the city's pulse to falter. Today every ship in the harbour was a floating lifeline, but rumours outpaced every tide. Ottoman banners on the far shore, Turkish galleys massing upriver. Midway through counting the cargo manifest, Nikitas paused. From the sloping lane above the docks, a column of riders picked its careful way down, standard bearer in front. The Emperor's courier, in imperial crimson, threaded through casks and dog-legged carts. His arrival cast a hush over the dockside din. In his hand gleamed a sealed scroll stamped with the double-headed eagle. He read aloud as dock workers slowed, then stilled entirely. By order of His Imperial Majesty, Constantine Palaiologos, all further ingress to the Neorion docks is forbidden. All dock labourers are summoned to the city's defence forthwith. No one asked him to repeat it. The men glanced up at the towers glimmering in the smoky morning and at the stockpiles destined never to reach another market. One last sack of pepper hit the cobbles, and for once nobody hurried to carry it away. High above the city's tangled streets, behind the battered curtain walls of Blackenay Palace, Constantine XI Palaiologos paced the chilly marble-floored hall. The oil lamp at his desk burned low as he waited for George Francis, his loyal minister and lifelong friend, to enter bearing a sheaf of grim news. A silver dish of bread and olives sat untouched. Every hour the Turkish lines tightened around the city, and every hour the granaries dwindled. Francis drew up before the desk and unrolled a blank parchment. "They count sparse barrels, my lord. The outer stores held less than we hoped. If we do not close the Neorion, there will be nothing left come April." He spoke with the dry precision of a man accustomed to sorrow. Constantine rubbed his jaw, then took up the pen. The decree would seal more than the dock gates. It would also mark the end of the city's ancient heartbeat, trade. He wrote in a clear, decisive hand, "By imperial command, the Neorion docks, and all merchant traffic therein, shall be closed as of this day, the 29th of March 1453. All provisions are to be reserved for defence. Dock workers are conscripted to the city's walls." Francis watched as Constantine pressed his signet into cooling wax. Somewhere beyond the palace, the last ship was already ashore, its cargo precious and soon forbidden. Later, Francis would dutifully record it. On the 29th day of March, at the bidding of the Emperor, the spice docks were sealed and their workers summoned to arms. The parchment curled as the wax dried. Constantine's hand lingered a moment at the imperial seal, the double-headed eagle rendered in red and gold. Outside, the distant clamour faded, and in its place rose an uncertain silence. The marble tiles of the palace audience chamber echoed under the boots of Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, the Venetian captain whose broad shoulders filled the space nearly to bursting. He arrived carrying salt and tension, a man built for battle, not for Byzantine protocol. At his side hung the sword of Saint Mark. His eyes, hard as flint, never left Constantine's face. "My lord," Giustiniani began, the Italian thick in his Greek, "to close the Neorion is to end all hope for the city's market. The merchants will panic. How will morale hold when their fortunes rot behind locked doors?" Constantine perched on the low-backed throne, his armour only half donned, hair damp with exertion. He held Giustiniani's gaze with exhausted patience. "The siege is coming, Captain. The Ottomans will not wait for your profits to be counted. We must feed our own while we have food left at all." A flicker of frustration crossed the Venetian's features. He gestured toward the high window, where the wind carried echoes of ship bells upriver. Venetian hands helped build these walls. We stand here as brothers in arms, but my own sailors say they'll be ruined. And what message, Majesty, do I send home? That Constantinople's gold is pepper now swept from their grasp. Send any message you like, Constantine replied. But the gates must close. I have to answer for every mouth that will stand on these ramparts before another dawn. Giustiniani's lips tightened to a grim line. He spat a curse, muttered, Sacra profitto, and spun on his heel, boots drumming out his reply. Behind him, Constantine clasped his hands and stared at the dying lamp. For Venetians, fair trade was the city's soul. But for Constantine, this day, survival would have to be enough. Demetrios gripped the tarred rope with hands bruised from years of salt and winter. His tunic clung to his back with sweat as he heaved another sack from the swaying launch onto the Nereon pier. Each bale gave off a hot, sweet scent. Cinnamon bark, scraped and rolled somewhere far in Ceylon, packed tight in rush matting and cloth. At his feet, more coils of cinnamon and a battered crate of ginger knocked together with every shout. Along the quay, a merchant from Alexandria in a faded indigo robe counted coins in careful stacks, lips pressed together. Above them, the rising sun caught the fringe of his keffiyeh, burnished gold. Business at the harbour always moved quickly. But today Demetrios and the rest moved with something closer to desperation. Orders flew down the gangplank. Hands now, faster. The Ottomans do not wait for slow men. On the wharf, the tallyman's voice rasped over the sound of gulls. 200, he snapped. That's the last. The deck creaked as the hold came up empty. Demetrios dragged the final sack, resting it for a breath. The cinnamon hit the planks with a soft thump and a cloud of spice dust. Near the piling, the harbour master in a black felt cap hammered a nail through a parchment seal, fixing the imperial closure notice to the pier post. The velvet-smooth Greek script spelled it out. The spice docks were closed, under the direct authority of the emperor. At the foot of the notice, resin dripped from the wax, still soft from the signet's press. Dock workers paused to squint, some muttering prayers, others just shaking their heads. Demetrios watched as the great ship from Alexandria slipped its moorings, the last legal spices bound for the city, and perhaps for any table, vanished into warehouses behind iron doors. Theodore, robed in deep crimson, walked slowly across the stone yard toward the looming doors of the great spice warehouse. The long ring of keys hung heavy at his belt, clinking with every deliberate step. His face was pale as he met the captain of the Imperial Guards, who stood waiting at the threshold with a letter signed by the emperor himself. Several soldiers, helmets polished, waited with iron nails and heavy planks. The doors stretched 2 men high, carved with faded lilies and curling dragons, the only witness to centuries of trade coming to a halt. Theodore held the great ring up, offering it with open palms. His voice caught on the familiar syllables as he recited the tally. 10,000 pounds of pepper, 4,000 cloves, 2,000 of nutmeg, 1,000 of ginger, all inventide. The captain nodded, lips pressed as thin as reeds. Wordlessly, Theodore handed over the keys. The heavy locking bar thudded home for the last time. The soldiers lifted thick timbers and set them across the gates, hammering nails deep into wood as metal struck stone. With each blow, the hush in the yard deepened. A small crowd had gathered near the wall, traders and apprentices. An old woman wrapped in a tarnished shawl. She pressed her hands to her face, and her shoulders shuddered with grief for the vanished nutmeg trade. The merchant's chorus gone silent, dreams shuttered with the warehouse. The iron-bound doors took the blows in miserable silence. Before leaving, Theodore ran his fingertips once along the worn lintel. Behind those doors, the aroma of distant islands would linger, locked away from every hearth in Constantinople until fate or new banners opened them once more. The arcade by the harbour shimmered with heat as Khalil, a Syrian merchant with nervous hands, bent low over a bronze brazier. Around him, ledgers and bound expense rolls stacked haphazardly. Years of trade compressed into folios scored with debts and promises. One by one, he fed the parchment into the flames, face lit harsh by the wavering orange. Soot curled into the air, mixing with the sharp tang of sea salt drifting in from the Golden Horn. Each page blackened, numbers and names writhing before they vanished in smoke. Khalil pressed his thumb hard against the cover of his main ledger before tipping it into the fire. The parchment sizzled and shrunk back. In the hollows of the archway, others joined in, Italian factors whispering to one another in low, tense voices. A Genoese youth tossing thin slips onto a growing pile. The smell of hot ink mingled with the distant odor of burned cloves and charred wood from a nearby kitchen. Beside Khalil, his apprentice, a boy named Yusuf, made one last circuit among the half-packed crates. He found a single jar, heavy with threads of saffron wrapped in waxed cloth, and tucked it beneath his sash. Eyes darting, he slipped away into the narrowing streets, bound for one of the shadow markets that sprang up in every siege. From the old seawall, merchant wives watched the smoke twist over the roofs, biting their lips. The burning was not just loss, but a final act of defiance. Debts erased before the invaders could seize anything worth counting. Khalil lingered until the last ledger fell to ash, listening to the echo of waves against stone and the first bells ringing for evening prayer. Eustathius turned the glazed clay jar over in his gnarled hands, its inside scratched bare by a wooden spoon. The last curl of cinnamon rattled at the bottom, no thicker than a child's finger. He squinted toward the window. The hippodrome's shadow stretched long across the yard, carrying with it the distant clang of armory bells and, hopscotching along the rooftops, the faint, excited crowing of soldiers boasting of their breakfast. He remembered other mornings, the feast for the Nativity of 1452, when the emperor himself invited diplomats from Venice and Genoa. Then Eustathius had stood in this same kitchen, ordering boys to open whole sacks, cinnamon from Ceylon, flaky with warmth, nutmeg and sugar packed tight in beeswax, even a pot of imported dates. He had dusted pastries so thick with spice that the scent carried all the way to the marble corridors. Now he pried the jar's lid open and found only a thin bale of parchment, folded atop 2 brittle sticks. By imperial ration, this was to be the last of it. Enough for one more evening meal, meant for Constantine alone, and perhaps the western bishops who still clung to the hope of arrival fleets. Eustathius set his mortar by the fire, hands careful but resigned. He snapped one cinnamon stick, then the last, and pressed them beneath the pestle. The sound was a soft crack, like kindling under the boot. He ground the splinters, dreaming of honeyed stews and the laughter of servants, their aprons bright with flour. In the rising steam from the simmering pot, he stirred the little mound of powder. The fragrance lifted into the smoky air, less powerful than memory, but all that remained. Outside, the city braced for night. Giovanni D'Andrea gripped the rail as the San Giorgio nosed forward under cover of dusk. Beneath a hastily hoisted Genoese flag, its familiar red cross painted slightly askew to fool the distant lookouts, the crew whispered prayers to St. Nicholas, hands raw from cinching cables. Their cargo, 11 barrels of cloves, packed so tight the staves bulged, stashed deep under layers of olive oil amphorae and sacks of split beans. The cloves alone might pay ransom for 3 families or bribe a city gate. The sound of water rolling off the bow mixed with the anxious rasp of Giovanni's breath as they glided past the smoke-stained towers of Galata. Astern, the Ottoman blockade zigged along the Bosphorus in shifting ranks. Someone coughed. Another man spat into the sea. They tried not to look at the fortress on the European shore, Rumile Hisari, where Mehmed's gunners had been hammering at anything that floated since April. A sudden thunder split the air. From the ramparts, a cannon belched smoke. The crew saw the ball before the sound, a monstrous rolling stone, said to weigh nearly 1,200 pounds, arcing low over the waterline. The impact was instant. Wood burst apart. Giovanni staggered as seawater and cloves gushed up through shattered planks, the fragrance sharp in his nostrils. Men leapt for timbers. Someone shouted for the Virgin. Barrels spun loose and bobbed away until an aftershock pulled them under. Long after the galley vanished, close to where the current eddied beside the shore, cloves floated, sluggishly twirling in the half-light. The scent drifted across the water, as if the Bosphorus too mourned what the city had lost. The city's walls trembled as the first light seeped past the Golden Horn on the 29th of May 1453. Eustathius listened from his cold kitchen as shouts echoed toward the hippodrome. Outside, priests paraded the icon of the Hodocria along the battlements, voices chanting in desperate unison, incense curling above their heads. Soldiers gathered at every breach and postern, helmets battered, eyes bright with hunger and fear. When the Janissary columns began their final push, the ground itself seemed to heave. At the Neorion, the docks that had fallen silent for weeks thudded back to life, not with cargo, but with boots and musket volleys. Eustathius knew, because he could hear the distant crash of splitting timbers and the shouts of Ottoman commanders. At the great spice warehouse, imperial soldiers fell in a last stand. Pikes braced before the groaning iron doors. The Janissaries, faces shadowed by feathered helms, surged forward. Axes shattered the locks. The metal bent, screeched, and then the doors gave way. What spilled out was not gold, but an explosion of pepper, cinnamon, and cloves, torn from crates as men trampled over each other. Someone seized a sack and swung it, dark grain spattering across the slick cobblestones. Blood mingled with spice dust, the air thick with sweetness and iron. Eustathius watched from an alley archway as the Neorion filled with smoke and noise. No one called for bread anymore. The conquerors, wild with hunger, grabbed fistfuls of saffron, letting thin red threads run through their hands. The docks that once smelled of distant worlds now echoed only with cries and the harsh ring of new banners unfurling in the sun. When the last banners settled and the Neorion's fires dwindled to embers, the hammer blows faded from the great warehouses. Eustathius did not linger to watch the soldiers strip the shelves bare, or the Persian merchants haul their battered ledgers through the ruined arcades. Most fled. The few who remained, survivors by habit, swept the broken glass and licorice dark peppercorns from their doorways into mounds that thickened day after day, a new kind of market dust. Sultan Mehem, riding through the gutted docks a week later, commanded his officials to count every key, to order the pilings recarved and the wharves rebuilt. Sometimes he walked among the empty warehouses with a stern frown, his new mariners explaining the ways of trade with careful words, yet the caravans did not return. Alexandria's spice fields and Venice's island depots fattened on the vanished cargoes of Byzantium. Sometimes thin-sailed galleys tried the old route, docking at wharves now haunted only by stray cats and the odd fisherman's torch. Their holds were light, their captains strangers who paid in coin alone and found no stories left to bargain for. In a damp prison cell beneath what had once been the imperial chancery, George Francis pressed a piece of tile to a scrap of paper. His script, crabbed and tired, recorded, "Here stood the great warehouse, sealed on the feast of St. Mark, lost to infidels a month less one day." He set down the stylus, eyes wavering toward the oily candle flame. Perhaps somewhere beyond the walls, the scent of cloves had not faded. The memory stayed. The docks shut on a Tuesday morning and never truly opened again.